And we will start with the bad. This is everybody's first game maker game. Has input like this. I've done it, you've done it, everybody's done it. It's hard-coded physical inputs. It's when your spaghetti code input loop says if W, if A, if S, if D, do the thing. These inputs are obviously not rebindable. Often you'll also see stuff where if there is any kind of gamepad support, it's going to assume a specific model of device, maybe even one in a specific slot, and certainly specific buttons. And there's a lot of problems with that. If there's on-screen glyphs, they're going to be totally fixed. And the only devices that are going to be supported are the ones that are super specifically hard-coded by the developers. This is a bad way to do things. It gets stuff working at all, but it's certainly not recommended. But you got to start somewhere. So let's go to better. So what's a better approach is abstracted inputs. And this is pretty straightforward. You just take all that complexity and configuration and you package it into your back end. So instead of saying, if A was pushed on the keyboard, then jump, you do if jump, whatever jump is, was pressed, then jump. Or for instance, a good thing to do with your gamepad input is instead of having, Xbox 360 controller in slot 0.a button dot pushed, you should do something like if any gamepad dot A was pushed, then do the thing. And by any gamepad, I mean whatever gamepad is controlled according to, whether I'm looking for the first one connected or just player one. But it should also mean any device. So if I've got a PlayStation 4 controller, then X should mean the A button. If it's an Xbox 360, then the A button. I really mean the bottom face button. So that sort of abstraction to make it simpler to deal with multiple devices all at once with cleaner input code. This moves the complexity into your back end and out of your input loop, so your input loop is nice and clean, like a plate completely cleared of its spaghetti. So that's good. And then what's controversial is external input translation, i.e. joy to key. This was most famously exhibited in the original version of Binding of Isaac. Edmund, if you're in the audience, don't kill me. I'm not trying to bash you. I understand your pain. Because this game was originally written in Flash, ActionScript 2 if you can believe it, which is quite an accomplishment. It did not have native gamepad support, so you had to rely on an external program like joy to key to get gamepad support. And what joy to key does is it listens for operating system level gamepad input, and then it translates that on the fly to operating system level keyboard inputs, so that your game just looks for the spacebar key. When you push A on the gamepad, it's like, hey, spacebar was pushed, do it game, and the game's none the wiser. The major obvious downside to this is you have some pretty bad input lag. The other major downside to this is that you have this external program you've got to configure, and it's just not a great experience. Only do this if you have to, and maybe don't even do it then. Nowadays we have some pretty good tools at us. I don't want to bash on anyone who has been forced to go down this road. I just want to sympathize with them in their pain and warn others to think ahead so that they don't get painted into this corner. So now let's talk about a couple of common problems that happen regardless of your approach, and some common symptomatic problems of input that perhaps hasn't been thought out as well as it could. A pathological case on PC is what I call the sea of buttons phenomenon. And the sea of button phenomenons is when you just literally have just an ocean of buttons, all these inputs you have. How many PC games have we seen that have this sort of input style? You have a unique input for almost every kind of thing. You add a new action, it's like zoom, lean, crouch. You add a new key that's rebindable for that. Until you have, this is obviously a joke, specific inputs for flush, toilet, evolve, Pokemon, and stop, collaborate, and listen. But this is a very keyboard-centric design philosophy, which means that you can paint yourself into a corner because now it's really hard to modify a game designed in this way to work on a gamepad. It can also be a crutch for lazy design, not necessarily if your game's name is NetHack. This is about the only way to go. And the typical obvious solution that everyone reaches for first is context buttons. Bundle up, stop, collaborate, and listen into a context-sensitive button along with flush, toilet, and evolve Pokemon that responds appropriately depending on the current context. There's a problem with this, though, which I like to call too much context. And this is a Penny Arcade comic. This little guy's like, I'm going to go up talk to the scientist. I'm definitely not going to set him on fire. And hey, buddy, what's up? Oops, I set you on fire. Because context buttons are, of course, dependent on context, and context is not always obvious. And so you can have a game where context is switched depending on if your gun is pointed at an NPC or not. And if it's pointed just over here, you push X, and boom, you just fried the mayor. So context is not necessarily always the obvious solution. I should also point out, though, that console games are not necessarily free of the sea of buttons phenomenon. Now, this slide here is also a joke. It's from Penny Arcade too, but you have like hold, pause, hold, super pause, etc. Examine blue chests, unclose hypermenu. You know, it's obviously a joke, but I've seen console games that have this kind of crammed full input, and so you see the reason for this is that on keyboard, at least you have a sea of buttons. On a gamepad, you don't, so you just like cram all this context-sensitive mode switching stuff all around because every single action in the game is active at once and crammed into one input device, and we've just run out of real estate. So to kind of summarize the problems we've seen so far in our high-level quick tour of the world of input is that some of our problems are that we don't have rebinding, that we sometimes don't have custom in-game glyphs, that we have input latency or lag, and that we either have too much context or not enough. And then also something I want to touch on real quick is the issue of instability in multiple controllers. Depending on how your input loop works, what happens if controller 2 gets unplugged and you're pulling it? Do you have a null exception error? Do you just return no input? Is the player have a nice, convenient way to recover from that? Like, what happens, you know? And these are just all things that just, like right now, the state of input is not, you know, super great.